Hello, everyone. So, for this class, we're going to talk about mostly global inequality. And so, just to give you an idea of where we're heading with that, we're going to start by looking at what global inequality actually looks like. Talk about some explanations of global inequality and something called the citizen income premium. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about its relationship to migration, which I think is very important, especially in this kind of era where there seems to be a lot of resistance to allowing people to migrate. So, here we have two different estimations of the global Gini coefficient. And the U.S.'s Gini coefficient is also displayed here. And it's over time from about like 1820 to a little into the 2000s. And by kind of this older, believe it's Durian-Margolin estimation of the Gini coefficient globally, we can see a continual increase in global inequality over time. Using the more recent estimation of global inequality, we see that there is this small decline recently. And many people attribute this recent decline in global inequality largely to development in China, because it just brought increased incomes for such a vast number of people. So, moving on from there, development has been really uneven. So, from 1820 to 1910, these are all these measures are in 1990 international dollars, but from 1820 to 1910, Britain's per capita GDP went from $2,000 to $5,000 a year. China's went from $600 to $550. It actually declined. This period corresponds with relatively closely to a period in China called the 100 Years of Shame, where both opium wars happened and kind of the colonial powers just carved out a bunch of chunks of China. And it kind of became apparent that they were no longer the global power that they believed themselves to be in that period. And similarly here, we see that India's per capita GDP increased only very modestly from $600 to $700. So, highly uneven development, and China and India being cases that subsequent to this period actually experienced some development. And alluding back to the previous graph, global inequality is either staying about the same or is declining slightly with increased growth in India and China and slower growth in the developed world. Another way that we can visualize global inequality is this graph called the elephant graph. And so on the horizontal axis, we have the percentiles of the global income distribution. And the height of the graph is cumulative gain in real income in percent between 1988 and 2008. So over that 20-year period, how much growth did each of these percentiles of the global income distribution experience? And we can see that people kind of in the 70th percentile and below experienced far more growth than almost anyone else except for people in the global 1%. So point A is the 50th percentile of the global income distribution, so people right near the middle experienced the greatest amount of income growth. B, that kind of 80th percentile of the global income distribution corresponds to the lower and middle class is in rich countries. And we can see that they experienced almost no growth over those 20 years. And so this corresponds with something else we know about, say, for instance, in the U.S., where wages have been flat since about the 1980s. And finally, we see at the far right-hand graph the global 1% that experienced almost as much growth in income as people in the very middle. It's also important to remember here that the absolute amount of income increase was far greater for those at the 1% because their starting income was also higher, right? So keep that in mind as well. And so this elephant graph illustrates the fact that, yes, we're seeing development. Incomes are stagnant in the middle within the rich countries, and the global 1% is doing very, very well. Another way we can look at this is this graph, which has come to be known as the Great Gatsby curve. And so on the horizontal axis here, we have inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient. And on the vertical axis, we have a measure of intergenerational income mobility. So we can see here a clear increasing relationship. So countries that are highly unequal also tend to have low intergenerational mobility. And so that helps to kind of verify this idea that we may have of people can't kind of change their circumstances as much as maybe they could in the past in these kind of highly unequal societies. So, talking about global inequality kind of generally at a global level and global inequality as the differences between countries, it's important to think about what is the driver of inequality. Is it that there's a large difference in incomes between countries, or is there a large difference in incomes between classes globally? So the idea is that is inequality being driven by between nation differences or within nation differences? Chang asserts that global Gini doesn't matter all that much because most of the inequality is between countries rather than within countries. We can look at this kind of empirically to see what explains income levels using regression analysis. And so if you look at global inequality in 1820, 20% of inequality is defined by location and 80% is defined from the income distribution within countries, which we can also think of as class. And by 1970, the ratios are reversed. Most inequality is explained by location, which country that people live in. So we live in a world today where most inequality is explained by the country in which people live. And so this implies something called the citizenship income premium. So because incomes depend a great deal on where people live, then if you just happen to be born in a rich country, you get an unearned increase in income simply due to being born in the right location. And so we can measure that. Here we have it measured relative to the Congo, which is the lowest income country globally, at least when these numbers were produced. And so there's a 9,200% increase in your income by being born in the U.S. relative to being born in the Congo. 7,100% relative to difference between Congo and Sweden, 1,300% for Brazil, and 300% for Yemen. Yemen being a relatively low-income country. And so 2/3 of the variation in income is explained just by differences in location, as of, I believe those numbers were produced in 2015. So a little bit less than our previous 1970 ratio. But still, the vast majority of inequality is explained by location. So it's also important to think about this citizenship premium across income levels. So for instance, if you're a very poor person in a very poor country, you might have a lot more to gain from moving location than a very rich person. Right? So the premium is greatest for those at the bottom end of this distribution and smaller for those at the top. this implies that poor people in poor countries can massively increase their income simply by moving. And if that person expects to end up at the low end of the income distribution in the country they're moving to, they may prefer to move to a country that is more egalitarian, that is more equal, right? So basically, there's this huge incentive created by the citizenship income premium for poor people to move to richer countries. So for poor people in poor countries to move to richer countries. And so another way we can think about this is a great inequality of opportunity at a global scale. And a helpful thought experiment here is thinking back to John Rawls's theory of justice. And John Rawls had this idea that whenever you're making policy within a country, to think through the justice implications of it, you should imagine yourself kind of outside the country behind what he called a veil of ignorance. And the idea is that behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know who you are. You don't know your age, your race, your gender, or any personal aspects of yourself. And from that kind of undifferentiated position, you should then evaluate policy. Because you don't know which qualities you're going to end up with once you step from behind the veil of ignorance. Importantly, John Rawls limited this idea specifically to a national level. But if we expand it to think about it internationally or globally, I don't think we would like to live in a world where most of your opportunities and your living standards are determined simply by where you live, which is a matter of chance, as it were. Also keep in mind that global inequality of opportunity slowly erodes over time as long as less developed countries grow faster than more developed countries, which has been the case for some time, but there's still a long ways to go. So, hold on just a moment. So let's think about migration now. Migration in the context of globalization is essentially the idea that if we're allowing commodities and money, or capital, to flow around the world to seek its highest rate of return, why can't we just let that happen with labor? So essentially, we've arrived at an era of high globalization, but an incomplete globalization because labor is not globalized. It's important to think about why labor is different. And importantly, I think it's best summed up by thinking about the fact that you can import capital and you can import goods, and they can just sit on a pallet for all you care, right? Like they are self-contained things that don't have any effects outside themselves or their uses. But you can't import a worker without also importing a person that has to survive, a person that has certain political rights and responsibilities. And that is a much trickier issue to deal with for a society than simply, a bunch of widgets coming over from Southeast Asia, right? And so we see that basically all countries on the face of the planet, especially rich countries, tend to place a high barrier on getting in. We have work visas. We have quota systems in some places. In some places like Canada, there's a strict evaluation system that's based on what you are expected to contribute economically. And so, because of this, there's a massive pent-up global demand for migration. But the most affluent nations that could kind of help these people the most, because they have the greatest income premium, citizenship income premium, have increased both legal and physical barriers to migration. And there's kind of these four tensions that are going on whenever we think about migration in the global context. People have a right to leave their home country, but they also lack the right to enter a new country. We've got limits on the mobility of labor, but not on capital and other commodities. Maximization of income, which presupposes people making free decisions, seems to be sacrosanct at a national level, but not at a global level. And finally, we have this idea that people should better themselves and develop, but they should develop in their home countries and not in the already developed countries. And so why do we privilege development of individuals within their own country over development of individuals in a new country? So it's very... I don't think that it's right to think about this without bringing in kind of the current political structure, right? So we've seen both in the US and in many countries in the EU, or in the instance of Great Britain recently in the EU, of a great political push by parties in the developed countries to keep migrants out. Because there's this idea that they have labor market implications. And we can look at some of these arguments empirically. So economists find time and time again that on average, when somebody migrates to a new country, generally speaking, they tend to contribute more in taxes than they take in public spending. That may take a few years, but on average, their contribution to kind of government revenues is more than what they take out in government programs. But it's also important to think about the pure labor market implications here, because we also see that these are the typically going to be more poor people from poor countries moving to rich countries because they've got the greatest amount to gain, which means that they also probably aren't going to be competing with Wall Street bankers for labor. They're going to be competing with framing carpenters and bricklayers. And we do find that whenever you've got a large influx of immigrants, these kind of lower skilled jobs tend to suffer a fall in wages, simply because employers can employ these workers that have less legal protections and less formal rights than native workers to do those jobs. And so on one hand, the kind of reactionary response to this is, well, we just need to keep those people out. A more nuanced approach that kind of recognizes that these people are just trying to better their own circumstances may focus more on compensating the people that are hurt by this, i.e. kind of lower skill native workers. So just keep that in mind, that this is a multifaceted thing, and there aren't any really simple answers to it, because immigrants do have labor market implications, and it's important to keep that in mind. So, kind of pivoting back to this more kind of global context, large gaps in income between countries creates political tensions in the global community. And these tensions are actually worse now than they've been at any point in the past, according to Roderick. And so that creates problems for other social global challenges, like, for instance, climate change. Many countries that are less developed are highly resistant to intervention in climate change because the idea is that, well, the developed world got to develop off of cheap coal power, and now you're asking us to pay more for energy, but we're still trying to, like, get basic health and educational services in place, right? And so is it fair to ask those nations to make those sacrifices? And maybe freeing up migration more and more would help ease some of those political tensions, because remittances could kind of cushion the blow of some of those policy interventions. We'll talk about that in more detail whenever we get to climate change and kind of how inequality maps onto that problem as well. So, recognizing all of these kind of tensions with migration and development, Danny Roderick comes up with a proposal. So he argues that even the harshest migrant working conditions present evidence of a pull effect, because even if the richest nations opened the door a crack and treated migrants not as full citizens, global inequality could be improved and people would still migrate. Sorry, not Roderick, Milanovic. So Milanovic suggests making a system of, not his words, second-class citizen, like permanent residents in the U.S. that pay taxes but cannot vote. This system separates the rights and duties that makes citizenship a gradient rather than an absolute 1 or 0. There's an idea that some portion of their taxes would be remitted to their origin country to support development. And this seems like an incredibly harsh proposal, especially the idea that some people will be extended some rights but not all rights. I know it doesn't sit well with me. But Milanovic puts forward the idea that, in a way, that's already what exists. For instance, undocumented workers are already second-class citizens that lack certain fundamental rights, and they lack any formal recourse to many of the problems that they may run into. And so it's kind of this tension of, here's a proposal that seems in some ways unjust, but is it preferable to not addressing the problem at all and having this entire class of undocumented workers that are easily exploited? It's difficult to say. And I think that Milanovic's proposal is interesting and provocative, and that's why I wanted to at least put it forward. And I think that this kind of sums up the harshness, one of his lines. Their very willingness to migrate reveals their belief that migration would increase their welfare. Once again, we still have to think about things like imperfect information and all that, where people may not actually know how much migration will make them better off. But it is tough to argue that, people as negative as undocumented status, or even this speculative proposed second-class status could be, people would still be willing to do it. And is that okay? I don't know. Think about it. So anyway, let's just wrap up here. Global inequality seems to be staying about the same or decreasing slightly. Most of the growth of the past few decades has gone to the top and middle of the global income distribution, kind of leaving middle classes and lower middle classes in the developed world not seeing much increase in their income, which may be another reason why increased political resistance to increased migration is on the rise. Next conclusion, most global inequality is explained by differences between countries rather than differences within countries, which implies the existence of this citizenship income premium. Migration could clearly be used to improve global inequality, but there's a deep political resistance to allowing it to do so. And finally, formalization of second-class citizens is a proposal, but certainly not without some problems. So I think that's all I've got for today. But yeah, it's global inequality is this very kind of sticky issue, and I think it's always important, especially if you are from a more highly developed country, to think about just how unequal income is globally and the incentive structures that individuals who migrate face. So I hope this was at least interesting, and that's all I got. Thanks.